Tonight, we're going to talk about the Habsburgs. Now, there's a specific way to measure what this family accomplished, and it's not by counting the crowns, although there were many, and it's not by counting the territories, although those stretched from the highlands of Peru to the plains of Hungary, from the Netherlands to Naples, from Spain to the Philippines. The way to measure it is by asking a simple question. For roughly 600 years, if you drew a map of Europe and asked which single family had the most influence over the largest number of people at any given moment, the answer, more often than not, was them, the Habsburgs. And that's a remarkable thing to be able to say about any family in human history. The name itself comes from a castle. Habsburg, which means Hawk's Castle in Old German, built around the year 1020 in what is now the Swiss canton of Aargau, on a small rocky outcrop overlooking the Aar River. It was not a particularly impressive fortress. It was not particularly well positioned. It was not the seat of a particularly powerful lord. It was a middling castle belonging to a middling family in a middling corner of the Holy Roman Empire. And if you had visited it in the 11th century and predicted that the descendants of the men who lived inside its walls would eventually rule Spain, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, Portugal, Mexico, Peru, and the Philippines simultaneously, you would have been laughed out of the courtyard, and probably rightly so. There was nothing about the Habsburgs of the 11th century that suggested they were destined for anything more than the modest fate of most minor Swabian nobility. But the story of how they got from that castle to the imperial thrones of Europe is not a story of military conquest, at least not primarily. It's not a story of theological brilliance or economic innovation. It's a story about marriage. It's a story about outliving rivals. It's a story about the patient, generation after generation, accumulation of claims through the calculated joining of bloodlines. And this brings us to what became the family's unofficial motto, a couplet in Latin that has been attributed to various sources, but that captures the essence of the Habsburg method with unusual precision. Bella gerent alii, tu Felix Austria nube, let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. Nam qui Mars allies, dat tibi regna Venus. For the kingdoms that Mars gives to others, Venus gives to you. And that's what they did. Over and over again, for 6 centuries, they married. And the marriages produced heirs, and the heirs inherited crowns, and the crowns accumulated in the hands of a family that had started with a castle on a hill in Switzerland. Before we get into it, as we are crowdfunded, I give thanks to those who are supporting. The links are in the pinned comment and description. Keeping us ad-free and sponsor-free and all the rest of it. And if you can't do that, that's okay. Just give us a like, comment, and subscribe, and that'll get us through. Anyway, let's begin. Now, the first Habsburg who actually matters in a European sense, the first one whose name you might encounter outside a specialist's monograph on Swabian nobility, is a man called Rudolf. Rudolf of Habsburg, born in 1218, and he is the figure who begins the family's ascent from provincial obscurity to imperial relevance. Rudolf was not particularly wealthy by the standards of the great German nobility. He was not particularly well connected. He was not particularly favored by the political currents of his day. What he was, and this is important, was patient, disciplined, and willing to spend decades slowly accumulating the small advantages that would eventually make him something more than his ancestors had been. The context in which Rudolf operated is one that requires a little bit of explanation, because the Holy Roman Empire in the mid-13th century was in a condition that historians have called the Great Interregnum, meaning the Great In-Between period. The last Hohenstaufen emperor, Frederick II, had died in 1250, and for nearly 2 decades afterward, no single candidate had been able to command sufficient support among the German electors to be recognized as emperor with any real authority. The imperial title existed. Various men claimed it. Some were even crowned. But the actual business of ruling was conducted by the local princes, dukes, and bishops who had used the vacancy to consolidate their own regional power at the expense of central authority. This period was, in institutional terms, a slow-motion disaster for imperial governance, but it was also a period in which a clever middling nobleman with modest ambitions could find opportunities that would have been closed to him in more organized times. Rudolf spent the years between 1250 and 1273 doing what a clever middling nobleman does in such circumstances. He fought small wars. He picked the right sides. He inherited some territories from his father, acquired others through his mother's line, and married a woman named Gertrude of Hohenberg who brought him further lands in the region. He built up a compact, if unglamorous, territorial base in what is now southwestern Germany and Switzerland. And when the German electors finally decided, in 1273, that they needed to end the interregnum and choose a real king of the Germans, they made what they thought was a safe and easy choice. They chose Rudolf. And the reason they chose him is precisely because he seemed harmless. He was in his mid-50s, which was old for the period. He had a modest power base that would not threaten the great princes who had grown accustomed to acting without imperial supervision. He was known to be pious, disciplined, and personally unpretentious. He was, in short, the kind of man that the electors believed they could control. They were wrong about that, incidentally, and this is the first appearance of a pattern that will recur throughout Habsburg history. The family's rivals consistently underestimated them, consistently believed that the current Habsburg was less formidable than he actually was, and consistently discovered too late that patience combined with method could accomplish what neither audacity nor charm could manage. Rudolf, once crowned, moved with unexpected decisiveness against the man who had accumulated the most territory during the interregnum, King Ottokar II of Bohemia. Ottokar had, during the 2 decades of imperial weakness, acquired duchies including Austria, Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola, essentially assembling a personal kingdom that stretched from the Bohemian mountains down to the Adriatic coast. He was the most powerful man in Central Europe, and he did not particularly want to acknowledge Rudolf's authority. The confrontation between them was resolved at the Battle of Marchfeld in August of 1278. Ottokar was killed on the field, and Rudolf found himself in possession of the duchies that Ottokar had accumulated, which he promptly transferred to his own sons. This is the moment. This is the specific moment when Austria becomes Habsburg territory, not because the Habsburgs had ancestral claims to Austria, not because Austria had chosen them, but because Rudolf had defeated the man who held it, and he had a family in need of endowment. From 1278 onward, Austria and its surrounding duchies would be the core territorial base of the Habsburg family, and they would remain so, in various configurations, until 1918. 640 years of continuous Habsburg rule over Austria began with Rudolf transferring the lands of a dead Bohemian king to his own sons. Rudolf himself died in 1291, and here the family encountered its first serious setback. The electors, having watched Rudolf turn what they thought was a caretaker kingship into a dynastic enterprise, decided that they would not repeat their mistake. They passed over Rudolf's son Albert and elected Adolf of Nassau instead. Albert, however, was not a man who accepted such decisions gracefully. He waited, he built alliances, he waited some more, and in 1298 he defeated and killed Adolf at the Battle of Gerlheim, taking the imperial crown that the electors had denied him. He would rule until 1308, when he was murdered by his own nephew in a dispute over inheritance, and after his death, the imperial crown left the Habsburg family for over a century. But the Austrian duchies did not leave the family. This is the crucial point about the Habsburg method. Even when they lost the imperial title, they retained their territorial base. Even when they were passed over by the electors, they continued to rule Austria and the surrounding lands as dukes, patiently developing the administrative infrastructure, the marriage networks, and the dynastic claims that would eventually allow them to return to the imperial throne with a strength that no elector could deny. Between 1308 and 1438, the Habsburgs were not emperors, but they were becoming something arguably more durable. They were becoming an institution. The century and a half between Albert's death and the family's decisive return to imperial power in 1438 was a period of quiet, unglamorous consolidation. The Habsburgs married into the ruling families of Bohemia, Hungary, Bavaria, and the northern Italian states. They accumulated smaller territories through inheritance and purchase. They built the administrative structures that would eventually distinguish Habsburg rule from the more feudal arrangements of their neighbors. And when Sigismund of Luxembourg, the last emperor of that dynasty, died in 1437 without a male heir, the Habsburgs were positioned, through the marriage of Sigismund's daughter to Albert of Habsburg, to inherit not only the imperial title, but also the crowns of Bohemia and Hungary. From 1438 onward, with only one brief interruption, the Holy Roman Emperor would be a Habsburg. For nearly 400 years, until the empire itself was dissolved by Napoleon in 1806, the imperial crown of Central Europe would rest on Habsburg heads, and the family that had started with a castle on a hill in Switzerland would become the closest thing that early modern Europe had to a permanent institution. Now, the man who inherited the imperial crown in 1438 was Albert II, and he is a figure who deserves a moment of our attention, even though his reign was brief, and in some ways, not particularly consequential in itself. Albert had married Elizabeth of Luxembourg, the daughter of Emperor Sigismund, and through this marriage, he acquired claims to the kingdoms of Hungary and Bohemia in addition to the imperial title and the Austrian duchies. For the first time in the family's history, the Habsburgs held 4 crowns simultaneously, and the geographic sweep of their authority ran from the Adriatic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains. Albert, unfortunately, did not live long enough to consolidate any of this. He died in 1439, only 2 years after inheriting his father-in-law's positions, apparently of dysentery, contracted during a campaign against the Ottoman Turks who were, at this point, beginning their long pressure on the eastern frontier of Christendom. He left behind a pregnant widow and a political situation of extraordinary complexity, which was inherited by his cousin Frederick III. Frederick III is a figure who does not appear in most popular histories, and if he does appear, he tends to appear as a kind of placeholder, a name in a list, a man who occupied the imperial throne for 53 years without accomplishing anything that catches the eye of a casual reader. And in one sense, that assessment is fair. Frederick was cautious to the point of paralysis. He was slow to make decisions and slower to execute them. He was defeated militarily on multiple occasions. He lost control of Hungary, temporarily lost control of Bohemia, and at various points was reduced to a territorial base so small that contemporaries wondered whether he could survive at all. He was famously frugal, personally shy, and possessed of a mystical streak that led him to spend considerable time on alchemy and astrology rather than the practical business of ruling. Contemporary chroniclers found him disappointing in almost every way that a medieval emperor could be disappointing. And yet, Frederick III presided over what is arguably the most consequential single act in the entire 600-year Habsburg story, and he did so entirely through the exercise of that unglamorous patience that had characterized the family from its beginnings. In 1477, Frederick arranged the marriage of his son Maximilian to Mary of Burgundy. And to understand why this marriage was so extraordinary, we need to spend a moment on what Burgundy was in 1477, because Burgundy is one of those political entities that has been so thoroughly absorbed by the geography of modern France that people often forget it was once something quite different. The Duchy of Burgundy in the 15th century was, in territorial and economic terms, one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated states in Europe. Under the rule of a cadet branch of the French royal family, the 4 Valois Dukes of Burgundy had assembled through a combination of inheritance, purchase, and skilled diplomacy, a composite state that included not only the Duchy of Burgundy itself, in what is now eastern France, but also the enormously prosperous Low Countries, meaning the territories that would eventually become Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, Flanders, with its cloth-making cities, Brabant, with its financial centres, Holland and Zeeland, with their emerging maritime trade, Artois and Hainaut and Namur. This was the economic heart of northern Europe, the wealthiest urban region north of the Alps, home to the great commercial fairs, the great banking houses, and the emerging class of merchant patricians whose accumulated capital would fund the age of exploration that was about to begin. The last of the 4 Valois dukes was Charles the Bold, and he had spent his reign attempting to convert Burgundy into an independent kingdom that would rival France itself. He had waged wars in every direction, and in January of 1477 he had been killed at the Battle of Nancy, his body found stripped and half-eaten by wolves in a frozen field 2 days after the fighting had ended, an image that contemporary chroniclers found genuinely shocking, and that seemed to symbolize the sudden collapse of everything he had tried to build. Charles left behind a single heir, his 19-year-old daughter Mary, who now stood in possession of the wealthiest inheritance in Northern Europe and completely unprotected against the ambitions of the men who wanted it. The man who wanted it most immediately was Louis XI of France, whose armies had already begun moving into Burgundian territory before Charles the Bold's body had been properly buried. Louis's position was straightforward. Burgundy had been carved out of French territory. Burgundy's dukes had always been French princes. Mary was a young woman without a husband and without an army, and the natural course of events would be for her lands to be reincorporated into the French crown through her marriage to a French prince chosen by Louis himself. This was, in medieval terms, a standard proceeding. It was how the French crown had absorbed most of its major provincial acquisitions over the previous 3 centuries. But Mary had other ideas. And more importantly, she had a mother-in-law, Margaret of York, who had other ideas, and a court council of Burgundian and Flemish nobles who had other ideas, and the wealthy cities of Flanders and Brabant who very much had other ideas. None of them wanted to be absorbed into France. All of them recognized that they needed a husband for Mary who would bring military resources to defend the inheritance, but who would also be sufficiently distant from Burgundy's neighbors that he would not simply subordinate their interests to some pre-existing agenda. Frederick III's son Maximilian was, in this respect, a nearly ideal candidate. He was young, he was reasonably handsome, he was heir to the imperial title, and he came from a family with sufficient resources to help defend Burgundy, but not so much power that he would immediately overwhelm the local nobility. The negotiations had actually begun before Charles the Bold's death, but they were completed with considerable urgency in the months that followed. Maximilian arrived in Ghent in August of 1477 and married Mary on the 19th of that month. He was 18 years old. She was 20. And this marriage, arranged by Frederick III over years of patient correspondence and negotiation, transferred the entire Burgundian inheritance into the Habsburg family. Not all of it, admittedly. Louis XI was able to seize and retain the Duchy of Burgundy itself, the original territorial nucleus in what is now eastern France. But the enormously more valuable Low Countries, the wealthy urban core of northern Europe, passed to Maximilian and through him to the Habsburg dynasty. From 1477 until the French Revolution, 312 years later, the Habsburgs would rule what became known as the Habsburg Netherlands, and the wealth of Flanders and Brabant would fund the family's imperial ambitions across 3 continents. This is the first great demonstration of the Habsburg marriage method operating at full effectiveness. Frederick III had not won Burgundy through military conquest. He had not won it through political maneuvering in the traditional sense. He had won it by arranging a wedding at exactly the moment when a wealthy heiress needed a husband who could protect her interests, and by having a son of appropriate age and status ready to fill that role. The kingdoms that Mars gives to others, Venus gives to you. The couplet was still a few decades away from being formulated, but the principle it described was already in operation. Maximilian himself is a fascinating character, and probably the first Habsburg who genuinely captures the imagination in the way that a Renaissance prince is supposed to. He was athletic, energetic, charming when he wanted to be, and possessed of a genuinely romantic sensibility that his father had entirely lacked. He wrote poetry. He commissioned autobiographical works that dramatized his own adventures. He patronized artists including Albrecht Dürer, whose portrait of Maximilian remains one of the defining images of Renaissance royal iconography. He was interested in printing, in armor, in tournaments, in mining technology, in classical scholarship, in essentially everything that a well-rounded prince of the early 16th century was supposed to be interested in. And he was, above all else, an indefatigable arranger of marriages, having learned from his father that the family's strategic method was to acquire crowns through the calculated joining of bloodlines. Mary of Burgundy died in 1482, only 5 years after their marriage, in a hunting accident. She had fallen from her horse while pursuing a heron with falcons, and the injuries were fatal. She left behind two young children, Philip and Margaret, and Maximilian was left as regent of the Burgundian Netherlands with a legal position that the local nobility disputed at every possible opportunity. He spent the next decade fighting to maintain his authority in the Low Countries against a combination of French pressure, Flemish urban revolts, and the persistent tendency of the local nobility to prefer any arrangement that did not involve a foreign prince telling them what to do. He was captured at one point by the citizens of Bruges and held for several months in humiliating conditions. He fought campaigns that produced mixed results in Gelders, in Friesland, and along the French frontier. And through all of this, he was also inheriting the Austrian territories from his father, becoming King of the Romans in 1486, and eventually succeeding Frederick III as Holy Roman Emperor when the old man finally died in 1493. But the truly consequential thing that Maximilian did was to arrange the marriages of his two children, Philip and Margaret, with the same strategic care that his father had shown in arranging his own marriage to Mary of Burgundy. And here we come to what is probably the most audacious dynastic operation in the history of European monarchy, the double marriage of 1496 and 1497, which linked the House of Habsburg to the newly unified Spanish crown of Ferdinand and Isabella, and which set in motion the sequence of events that would produce, within a single generation, the largest political inheritance ever assembled by a European family through peaceful means. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile had, through their own marriage in 1469, unified the two great Iberian crowns and created what would become known as Spain. In 1492, they had completed the reconquest of Muslim Granada, expelled the Jews from their territories, and financed the Genoese navigator Christopher Columbus on the voyage that would inadvertently open the Americas to European colonization. They had 2 sons and 3 daughters, and they were, in the middle 1490s, engaged in the same kind of dynastic calculation that Maximilian was pursuing in Central Europe. They wanted alliances against France, which was their principal geopolitical rival, and they wanted to secure their children in marriages that would enhance Spanish power. Maximilian and the Spanish monarchs recognized that their interests aligned, and they arranged that Maximilian's son Philip would marry Ferdinand and Isabella's daughter Juana, and that Maximilian's daughter Margaret would marry Ferdinand and Isabella's son Juan. 2 marriages, linking 2 families, uniting the emerging Spanish Empire with the emerging Habsburg Empire. At the time these marriages were arranged, in 1495, no one involved could have predicted what would actually happen. And what happened was that Ferdinand and Isabella's son, Juan, died in 1497, only months after his wedding. Their eldest daughter, Isabella, died in 1498. Isabella's son, Miguel, who was briefly heir to all the Spanish crowns, died in 1500. And by a sequence of deaths that no one had anticipated, Juana, who had married Philip of Habsburg, found herself the sole surviving heir to the united crowns of Castile, Aragon, Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, and the newly discovered territories in the Americas. Through his marriage, Philip stood to inherit, on behalf of his children, essentially the entire Spanish Empire. The son that Philip and Juana produced from this marriage was born in the Flemish city of Ghent on the 24th of February in 1500, and he was given the name Charles. He was, at the moment of his birth, unremarkable in the sense that a great many royal children are unremarkable. He was one grandson among several, and the various inheritances that would eventually converge upon him were still, in 1500, distributed among a number of living relatives whose survival could not be predicted. But over the course of the next 20 years, through a sequence of deaths that his contemporaries described as providential, and that modern historians describe as statistically improbable but not impossible, Charles accumulated the largest set of hereditary claims that any European monarch had ever held. Let me sketch the geography of what he inherited, because the scale of it genuinely needs to be spelled out in territorial terms to be understood properly. From his father Philip, who died in 1506 when Charles was 6, he inherited the Burgundian Netherlands, meaning Flanders, Brabant, Holland, Zeeland, Hainaut, Namur, Artois, Luxembourg, and the associated territories. This gave him the wealthy urban core of northern Europe, the great cloth cities of Flanders, the banking centres of Brabant, and the emerging maritime economies of the Dutch coast. From his maternal grandfather Ferdinand of Aragon, who died in 1516, he inherited the crown of Aragon, which meant Aragon itself, Catalonia, Valencia, the Balearic Islands, and the Aragonese territories in Italy, which included Sardinia, Sicily, and the Kingdom of Naples. From his maternal grandmother Isabella of Castile, whose inheritance came to him through his mother Juana, who was still technically alive, but had been declared unfit to rule due to a mental condition that we will return to. He inherited the crown of Castile, which meant Castile itself, Leon, Galicia, Asturias, Granada, Navarre, and the enormously expanding territories that Spanish conquistadors were currently seizing in the Americas. And from his paternal grandfather Maximilian I, who died in 1519, he inherited the Habsburg hereditary lands in Austria, Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, Tyrol, and the family's original Swabian and Alsatian holdings. And on top of all of this, in June of 1519, 6 months after Maximilian's death, the electors of the Holy Roman Empire chose him, in the face of substantial French opposition, and after considerable financial pressure applied by the Fugger banking family, as Holy Roman Emperor. The resulting political entity, which historians usually describe as the Empire of Charles V or the Habsburg Universal Monarchy, is genuinely difficult to describe in ordinary terms. It included Spain and its expanding American possessions. It included the Netherlands and its wealthy trading cities. It included Austria and the hereditary lands of the family in Central Europe. It included the Italian peninsula's southern half through Naples and Sicily, and its central portions through Milan, which he acquired later through military action against France. It included territories in North Africa, in the Philippines, in the Caribbean, and eventually across most of South America and Central America. And it was governed by a single man who, when the whole thing was assembled, was 19 years old. Charles is, in some ways, the tragic figure of the Habsburg story, and I want to be careful here about how I use the word tragic, because he was not tragic in the sense of failing or being crushed by his circumstances. He was tragic in the sense that he understood, more clearly than any of his advisors, and possibly more clearly than any monarch of his generation, that what he had inherited was ultimately unmanageable, and he spent 40 years trying to hold it together through sheer force of personal effort before eventually admitting defeat and dividing it. He was serious, dutiful, intelligent, and possessed of a personal integrity that even his enemies acknowledged. He was also, in physical terms, distinctly unimpressive. He had inherited the Habsburg jaw, that prognathic malformation of the lower mandible that would become increasingly pronounced in later generations of the family, and it was already visible in Charles to the extent that he could not close his mouth completely, could not chew food properly, and spoke with a slight impediment that made his Spanish and French pronouncements slightly slurred. Contemporary portraits by Titian, who painted him repeatedly, are honest about this feature while also managing to convey a genuine dignity that Charles seems to have projected in person. He spent his reign traveling. This is one of the extraordinary facts about him, and it deserves emphasis because it is one of the ways in which he differed from the more sedentary monarchs of his era. Charles crossed the Alps 10 times, traveled the length of Spain 9 times, crossed to France 4 times, sailed to England twice, made 2 expeditions to North Africa, and visited Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy repeatedly. He is estimated to have spent roughly a quarter of his adult life in transit, moving between the various portions of his composite monarchy in an attempt to maintain personal contact with the local elites who were expected to govern in his name. He gave speeches in multiple languages. He famously said that he spoke Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to his horse, a joke that survives in various versions, but that captures something real about the linguistic demands of ruling territories where no single language was universally understood. The Netherlands were his emotional home. He had been born in Ghent, raised in Mechelen by his Aunt Margaret of Austria, who served as regent for the Low Countries during his minority, and educated in the sophisticated Burgundian court tradition that his great-grandfather Philip the Good had established. His first language was French, or more precisely the French dialect spoken in the Burgundian territories, and he spoke it with genuine ease and cultural fluency throughout his life. When he arrived in Spain in 1517 to take up his inheritance from his maternal grandparents, he was 17 years old, spoke almost no Spanish, and brought with him a court of Flemish advisors who immediately began appointing themselves to lucrative Spanish positions in a manner that the Castilian nobility found deeply offensive. The result was a revolt, the revolt of the Comuneros in 1520 and 1521, which Charles suppressed, but which taught him a lesson that he never forgot. Ruling Spain required speaking Spanish, appointing Spanish officials, and treating Spanish institutions with respect, and Charles adapted to this requirement over the course of his reign with a thoroughness that his early years would not have predicted. Now, the mother of Charles requires her own moment of attention, because Juana of Castile is one of the more painful figures in the family's history, and her fate touches on themes that would recur across generations. Juana had been in love with her husband Philip to a degree that contemporaries found excessive. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, apparently of typhoid fever contracted after playing a strenuous game of ball in the summer heat, Juana's grief manifested in behavior that her father Ferdinand of Aragon used as justification for having her declared incapable of governing. She refused to allow Philip's body to be buried immediately. She traveled with the coffin through the Castilian countryside for months, allegedly opening it periodically to look at her husband's face. Whether these accounts are entirely accurate or whether they were exaggerated by contemporaries and later chroniclers for political reasons is a question that historians still debate. What is not in dispute is that Ferdinand used her behavior to justify confining her in the castle of Tordesillas in 1509, where she remained for the next 46 years, from the age of 29 to her death at 75 in 1555. She was legally the Queen of Castile throughout this entire period. Her son Charles ruled in her name. But she never left the castle, was permitted no visitors except those approved by her keepers, and lived out her existence in conditions that reduced her progressively to the state of confusion and disconnection from reality that her jailers had originally claimed to be treating. The historical judgment on Juana has shifted over the centuries. She was called Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad, in the Spanish tradition, and this designation was used to justify her confinement and the transfer of her authority to her father, and then her son. Modern historians and psychiatrists who have examined the surviving documentation have generally concluded that whatever mental instability she may have suffered, it was substantially aggravated, and perhaps largely caused by the isolation and treatment she received at Tordesillas. Her father and her son had powerful political incentives to keep her out of the way, and they did so. She is, in this sense, the first Habsburg to be inconvenient to the family's dynastic project, and the family's solution to inconvenience was to lock her up and forget her. It is not the last time this pattern will appear. Charles himself, whatever his private feelings about his mother's situation, ruled in her name without ever seriously considering releasing her from confinement, and he pursued the political program that his inheritance required with the sustained energy that we have already noted. That program can be summarized under 4 headings, and each of them consumed years of his life and prodigious quantities of the resources that his composite monarchy generated. The first was the struggle against France. The French crown under Francis I, who had been the other principal candidate for the imperial election in 1519, viewed the Habsburg universal monarchy as an existential threat that had to be broken. France was surrounded on multiple frontiers by Habsburg territories, in the Netherlands to the north, in Spain to the south, in Italy across the Alps, in Franche-Comté to the east, and Francis calculated that if he did not shatter the Habsburg system through aggressive military action, France would eventually be reduced to a client state within a Habsburg universe. Charles and Francis fought four major wars between 1521 and 1544, exchanged territories in Italy multiple times, and produced one of the most striking single events of the era in February 1525, when Charles's forces captured Francis himself at the Battle of Pavia. The French king was held prisoner in Madrid for over a year, released only after signing a treaty that he immediately repudiated once he was safely back in France, and the wars continued as if the capture had never occurred. The Franco-Habsburg rivalry that Charles inherited from his grandfathers would continue in various forms for the next 2 centuries, and would not be finally resolved until the marriage of Louis XVI to Marie Antoinette in 1770, itself a Habsburg French dynastic union that ended in the revolutionary tragedies that we will address in later sections. The second great struggle of Charles V's reign was the conflict with the Ottoman Empire, and this deserves its own careful treatment because it involved not simply military engagement, but a genuine clash between the two universal monarchies of the 16th century. The Ottoman Sultan Suleiman, the Magnificent, who came to the throne in 1520, was Charles's exact contemporary and his exact rival in the sense that both men believed themselves to be the legitimate heir to the Roman imperial tradition and the divinely appointed leader of their respective religious communities. Suleiman styled himself Caesar of Rome and Padishah of the Islamic world. Charles styled himself Holy Roman Emperor and Defender of Christian Europe. Neither man's claim was compatible with the other's, and the resulting conflict was fought across the Mediterranean, across the Danube frontier of Central Europe, and across North Africa for nearly 4 decades. The Ottoman advance had been proceeding for over a century before Charles inherited his throne. Constantinople had fallen to maimed II in 1453. The Balkans had been progressively absorbed into the Ottoman system throughout the 15th century. And in August of 1526, at the Battle of Mohács, Suleiman crushed the Hungarian army so comprehensively that the Hungarian king Louis II died fleeing the field, drowning in a stream while trying to escape in his armor. Louis II was married to Charles V's sister Mary, and he was the last of the Jagiellonian dynasty that had ruled Hungary and Bohemia for over a century. His death without heirs meant that the crowns of Hungary and Bohemia became available, and the person who was next in line through a dynastic arrangement that Maximilian had set up decades earlier was Charles V's younger brother, Ferdinand of Habsburg. From 1526 onward, the Habsburgs held the Hungarian and Bohemian crowns as well, adding 2 more kingdoms to the already staggering list of family possessions. The problem was that after Mohács, most of Hungary was actually under Ottoman control. The Habsburgs held only the western strip of the kingdom, running along the Austrian frontier, plus the mining regions in what is now Slovakia. Central Hungary, including the capital of Buda, was administered directly by Ottoman governors. Transylvania in the east was ruled by a Hungarian noble family who held their position as vassals of the Sultan. This partition of Hungary would persist for over a century and a half, until the Habsburgs finally reconquered the central Hungarian territories in the late 17th century, and it meant that the eastern frontier of Habsburg Central Europe was a constant military problem, requiring the maintenance of expensive fortress systems and standing garrisons across a defensive line running from the Adriatic to the Carpathians. In 1529, Suleiman pressed his advantage westward and laid siege to Vienna itself. This was the first Ottoman siege of Vienna, and it was in some ways the more genuinely dangerous of the 2 Ottoman sieges that the city would eventually endure. Charles V's brother Ferdinand, who was administering the Austrian territories on Charles's behalf, held the city with a combination of Austrian, German, and Bohemian troops, and the siege was lifted after several weeks, when weather conditions deteriorated and Suleiman's supply lines proved inadequate for a prolonged campaign so far from his base in Constantinople. The Ottomans withdrew, But the fact that they had reached Vienna at all sent a message to the Habsburg court that the eastern frontier could not be neglected. For the rest of his reign, Charles would have to divert substantial resources from his western struggles against France to the maintenance of the Danube frontier against the Ottomans. And this two-front strategic problem was one of the structural conditions that made his universal monarchy so difficult to sustain. The third great struggle of the reign, and probably the one that consumed more of Charles's personal energy than either of the others, was the confrontation with the Protestant Reformation. Now, the Reformation is a subject that requires its own extended treatment, and we cannot do it justice in the space we have here. But the essential development from Charles's perspective was this. In October of 1517, 7 months before Charles arrived in Spain for the first time, an obscure Augustinian friar named Martin Luther had posted a set of 95 theses on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, initiating a theological argument about indulgences that spiraled rapidly into a general challenge to the authority of the Roman Church. By 1521, when Charles convened the Diet of Worms and summoned Luther to appear before him, the movement had spread across Germany with a velocity that surprised everyone, including Luther himself. Printing presses had turned Luther's pamphlets into bestsellers. German princes had begun to see Reformation as a way of escaping papal taxation and asserting local authority over church properties within their territories. Whole regions were converting. At Worms, Charles made a decision that he would defend for the rest of his life, and that decision was to stand with Rome. Luther appeared before the Diet, refused to recant, and famously declared, or was reported to have declared, that his conscience was captive to the word of God and that he could not and would not retract anything. Charles issued the Edict of Worms, declaring Luther an outlaw of the empire, which meant in theory that any subject could kill him without legal consequences. In practice, Luther was protected by Frederick the Wise of Saxony, who arranged for him to be spirited away to the Wartburg castle and hidden there, while Charles's attention was diverted by his other imperial concerns. Luther used his time in hiding to translate the New Testament into German, producing a text that would shape the German language for the next 4 centuries, and that would give the Reformation a scriptural foundation in the vernacular that Rome had no comparable resource to counter. Charles genuinely believed, throughout his reign, that the religious division of Christendom was reversible. He believed that if he could just find the right combination of theological negotiation, imperial pressure, and military force applied at the right moment against the right princes, he could restore the religious unity of his empire. He convened diets. He arranged colloquies between Catholic and Protestant theologians. He pressed for a general council of the Church that would produce reforms sufficient to satisfy the moderate Protestants and reunite Christendom. And when the Council of Trent finally began meeting in 1545, he pressed it to address the reformable abuses that had genuinely produced Protestant grievances, rather than simply reasserting Catholic doctrine against Protestant deviations. He was disappointed on this last point. The Council of Trent, over its 18 years of intermittent meetings, produced a program of Catholic reform and clarification of doctrine that codified Catholicism in the form it would maintain until the 20th century, but it did not produce anything that could serve as a basis for reunion with the Protestant churches. The division of Western Christendom was permanent, though Charles refused to admit this until near the end of his life. His military campaigns against the Protestant princes reached their climax at the Battle of Muhlberg in April of 1547, when Charles personally led an army against the Schmalkaldic League, the alliance of Protestant princes who had organized themselves against him. He won the battle decisively, captured the leading Protestant princes including John, Frederick of Saxony, and Philip of Hesse, and appeared for a moment to have accomplished what decades of effort had not previously produced. Titian painted him in the aftermath, mounted on a war horse in full armor, holding a lance, and the resulting portrait, the equestrian portrait of Charles V, hangs today in the Prado in Madrid and is one of the great images of Renaissance military portraiture. It captures Charles at the moment of what he probably believed was his greatest triumph. But the triumph was hollow. Within 5 years, the Protestant princes had regrouped, formed a new alliance with the Catholic French crown, and reversed Charles's gains through a combination of military action and diplomatic pressure. Charles was forced to flee across the Alps in the winter of 1552, one of the humiliations of his reign, and the eventual settlement, the Peace of Augsburg of 1555, which his brother Ferdinand negotiated on his behalf, formalized the religious division of the empire on the principle of cuius regio, ius religio, meaning whose realm, his religion. Each prince would determine the religion of his own territory. Protestantism was legally recognized in the empire. The unity of Christendom that Charles had spent his life trying to restore was formally acknowledged to be beyond recovery. Charles's response to this failure and to the accumulated exhaustion of his 4 decades of ceaseless labor was one of the most extraordinary abdications in European monarchical history. In October of 1555, in a ceremony in Brussels, he formally transferred the Netherlands to his son Philip. In January of 1556, he transferred the Spanish crowns and the American territories. In September of 1556, he transferred the imperial title to his brother Ferdinand, though the actual imperial election of Ferdinand as his successor took a further 2 years to complete. Having systematically divested himself of the largest political inheritance in European history, he retired to a small residence he had commissioned adjacent to the monastery of Yuste in the remote Extremadura region of western Spain. The residence at Yuste was not a grand palace. It was a modest house of a few rooms, built into the side of a hill next to a Hieronymite monastery, with a chapel where Charles could hear Mass without leaving his sickbed if his gout was troubling him. He brought with him a modest establishment of servants, some paintings by Titian that he particularly loved, some clocks that he was mechanically fascinated with, and a collection of books. He lived there for less than 2 years, from February of 1557 until his death in September of 1558. He was 58 years old. He had, by the standards of his family, ruled for an ordinary length of time, 37 years since inheriting the Spanish crowns, 39 since being elected emperor. He had, by any reasonable measure, worked harder than any European monarch of his century. And he had concluded that the task he had inherited was beyond the capacity of any single person to accomplish, and that the only responsible thing to do was to divide it and hand it off to men who would be responsible for narrower and more manageable portions of it. The division of the Habsburg inheritance that Charles arranged in 1555 and 1556 is the most important structural fact about the family's subsequent history, and it deserves careful attention because everything that followed for the next century and a half was shaped by the specific way that Charles distributed his legacy between his son Philip and his brother Ferdinand. Philip received what contemporaries and later historians would call the Spanish inheritance, and the scale of that inheritance requires a careful enumeration because it is genuinely difficult to grasp in the abstract. He received Spain itself, meaning the crowns of Castile and Aragon and everything that those crowns had assembled over the previous 3 centuries, including the American territories that were expanding almost yearly as Spanish conquistadors pushed further into South America and northward into what would become Mexico and the American Southwest. He received the Italian possessions, meaning the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily, the Duchy of Milan, which Charles had acquired through military action against France, and the island of Sardinia. He received the Franche Comté, that portion of the old Burgundian inheritance that lay east of the modern French border. And he received the Netherlands, meaning the entirety of the wealthy Low Countries that had come into the family through the marriage of Maximilian and Mary of Burgundy 80 years earlier. He also received, though this took a few years to formalize, claims to the Portuguese crown through his mother Isabella of Portugal, and when the Portuguese royal line failed in 1580, Philip would activate those claims and unite the Iberian Peninsula and the Portuguese overseas empire under his rule for the next 60 years. Ferdinand received what became known as the Austrian inheritance, and this was considerably smaller in territorial and economic terms, but was strategically located at the heart of Central Europe. He received the Austrian hereditary lands, meaning Austria itself, Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, and the Tyrol. He received the imperial title of Holy Roman Emperor. He received the Hungarian and Bohemian crowns that had come to the family in 1526, though as we noted most of Hungary was still under Ottoman occupation and would remain so for another century and a half. He received the ongoing responsibility for defending the eastern frontier of Christendom against Ottoman pressure, which meant maintaining an expensive military system that the Austrian territories alone could not really afford. And he inherited the complex constitutional relationship with the German princes that being Holy Roman Emperor required, a relationship that had been made much more difficult by the religious settlement at Augsburg that Ferdinand himself had negotiated. The division of 1556 created two Habsburg branches that would coexist for the next 150 years, and their relationship was one of the more interesting arrangements in early modern European diplomacy. The Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs were allies. They coordinated their foreign policies. They intermarried repeatedly to maintain the dynastic ties between the two branches. They supported each other in their respective struggles against France, against the Protestant powers, against the Ottomans. And yet they were also, in their own quiet way, rivals for prestige within the family, and there were moments across the 17th century when Spanish and Austrian interests diverged sufficiently that the coordination broke down, and each branch had to pursue its own path. The essential point for understanding what follows is that from 1556 onward, when we speak of the Habsburgs, we are speaking of two related but distinct dynastic enterprises, and their fortunes would follow different trajectories. Now, Philip II of Spain deserves an extended treatment because he is one of the more consequential monarchs of the 16th century, and because his reign shaped the identity of the Spanish Habsburgs for the next century and a half. He was born in Valladolid in 1527, which meant that unlike his father Charles, he grew up as a Spaniard rather than a Fleming, spoke Castilian as his native language, and identified emotionally and culturally with Spanish rather than Burgundian traditions. He was the product of his father's marriage to Isabella of Portugal, and he was thoroughly educated in the demanding curriculum that early 16th century humanists had developed for the training of future rulers. He studied Latin, mathematics, architecture, theology, and the Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Italian languages. He was serious, methodical, and possessed of a personal piety that even by the intense standards of Spanish Catholicism of his era was considered notable. He had a peculiar approach to the practice of rulership that shaped everything about how his reign functioned. He was, unlike his father, essentially sedentary. Where Charles had spent his life crossing the Alps and the Pyrenees to maintain personal contact with his various territories, Philip believed that governance was better conducted from a fixed center by means of paper. He established his court at Madrid, a modest town in the middle of the Castilian meseta that he progressively developed into a functioning capital. He built the monastery of San Lorenzo del Escorial, that enormous granite complex about 30 miles northwest of Madrid, which served simultaneously as a royal residence, a Hieronymite monastery, a burial site for the Spanish Habsburgs, and a workspace where Philip could conduct the paperwork of his global empire in the physical presence of the family dead. He spent hours every day reading dispatches, annotating them in his own hand, drafting responses, and consulting with the various councils that he had established to advise him on the different portions of his monarchy. The Council of State, the Council of the Indies for American Affairs, the Council of Italy, the Council of Flanders. Each portion of his empire had its own institutional structure, and Philip sat at the center of all of them, reading, annotating, deciding. The problem with this system, and it was a genuine problem that affected the exercise of Spanish power throughout Philip's reign, was that it produced considerable delays. A dispatch from Brussels to Madrid might take 3 weeks to arrive. A dispatch from Manila might take a year or more. A dispatch from Lima or Mexico City would take months in each direction. By the time Philip had read a report annotated it, drafted a response, and had that response transmitted back to the relevant governor. The situation on the ground had often changed substantially, and his instructions were sometimes irrelevant by the time they arrived. His officials in the field, who understood this, had to make decisions on their own initiative and hope that Philip would eventually endorse them, and the resulting improvisation was one of the sources of both the surprising successes and the striking failures of Spanish policy during his reign. His nickname among his subjects, and this is a nickname that captures something real about how his rule was experienced, was Philip the Prudent. Careful, deliberate, methodical, but also slow. The four great themes of Philip's reign were the defense of Catholicism, the exploitation of the American Empire, the ongoing struggle against France, and the increasingly desperate attempt to hold on to the Netherlands. Each of these deserves at least a few sentences. Philip was, throughout his reign, the great Catholic monarch of Europe. This was not simply a matter of personal piety, though that was genuine. It was a matter of political calculation and dynastic identity. The Spanish crown had built its legitimacy on the reconquest of Muslim Iberia and on the propagation of Catholicism across the American territories, and Philip understood that Spanish identity and Catholic identity were, by the middle 16th century, essentially inseparable in the minds of his subjects. He supported the Council of Trent through its final sessions in the 1560s. He funded the Society of Jesus that Ignatius of Loyola had established as the intellectual shock troops of the Counter-Reformation. He maintained the Spanish Inquisition as an institution for enforcing doctrinal conformity within his territories, and while the Inquisition's reputation has been substantially exaggerated by later Protestant and Enlightenment propaganda, it was nonetheless a genuinely effective mechanism for suppressing religious dissent within Spain and its dependencies. And he committed Spanish military and financial resources to the defense of Catholicism across Europe on a scale that no other Catholic monarch could match. The exploitation of the American Empire during Philip's reign reached scales that transformed the European economy and eventually undermined the Spanish economy itself. The silver mines of Potosi, in what is now Bolivia, and Zacatecas, in what is now Mexico, produced staggering quantities of precious metals that were shipped to Spain in the annual treasure fleets. Roughly 17,000 tons of silver arrived in Seville between 1500 and 1650. The Habsburg treasury received a fifth of everything mined, the quinto real, and used this income to finance the family's political programs across Europe. But the sudden influx of precious metals produced inflation across the Spanish economy that Spanish institutions were not prepared to manage, and the silver arriving from America was often already committed to servicing loans from German and Genoese bankers who had funded the previous year's military campaigns. Spain was, throughout Philip's reign, technically the wealthiest state in Europe and simultaneously chronically insolvent, declaring bankruptcy multiple times in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596, and defaulting on its debts to the bankers who had made his global operations possible. The struggle against France was continued from his father's era, though the specific character of the conflict shifted after 1559, when the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis ended the direct Habsburg-Valois wars that had dominated the earlier 16th century. France was subsequently consumed by its own religious civil wars, the wars of religion between Catholics and Huguenots, and Philip's intervention in these wars was designed to prevent the emergence of a strong Protestant France that would threaten his territories. He supported the Catholic League against the Huguenot Henry of Navarre through the 1580s and 1590s, spent enormous sums subsidizing Catholic armies within France, and only reluctantly accepted the eventual outcome when Henry converted to Catholicism in 1593 and was recognized as King of France as Henry IV. The struggle in the Netherlands was, in some ways, the defining tragedy of Philip's reign and the specific issue that most damaged the long-term Spanish position in Europe. The wealthy provinces of the Low Countries had been the emotional home of his father Charles, but they were, by the time Philip inherited them, increasingly Protestant in religious orientation, and increasingly resentful of what they perceived as Spanish domination of institutions that had traditionally enjoyed local autonomy. Philip's response, which he pursued with the methodical determination that characterized all his major decisions, was to enforce Catholic orthodoxy through the Inquisition, to maintain Spanish military garrisons in the provinces, and to appoint Spanish officials to positions that Netherlandish nobility believed should belong to them. The result was the revolt that began in 1568 and would continue in various forms for 80 years. Philip sent his most capable general, the Duke of Alba, to suppress the revolt in 1567. Alba established the Council of Troubles, which contemporaries called the Council of Blood, and executed over 1,000 people in his first year, including several prominent nobles whom he had lured to the Netherlands with promises of safe conduct. The severity of Alba's methods, rather than suppressing the revolt, radicalized it and expanded it. William of Orange, one of the great political figures of the era, emerged as the leader of the Dutch resistance, and the 7 northern provinces eventually formed themselves into the Dutch Republic that would achieve de facto independence by the early 17th century, and formal recognition of that independence at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. The southern provinces, which correspond roughly to modern Belgium, remained under Habsburg rule, but as a semi-autonomous territory, whose administration became progressively more expensive and less rewarding. The most spectacular failure of Philip's reign, and the moment that has entered popular historical memory more thoroughly than perhaps any other event of the 16th century, apart from Luther at Worms, was the Great Armada that he sent against England in the summer of 1588. The context requires a moment of explanation, because the Armada was not the impulsive gesture that popular history sometimes portrays it as. It was the culmination of decades of tension between Spain and England that had built up through a combination of religious, economic, and personal grievances that Philip had come to regard as intolerable. Philip had, briefly, been King of England himself. In 1554, he had married Queen Mary I, the elder daughter of Henry VII, in an arrangement that would have united the Spanish and English crowns had it produced children. Mary was Catholic, had spent her reign trying to restore Catholicism in England after the Protestant policies of her father and half-brother, and viewed the marriage to Philip as an alliance of Catholic monarchies against the Protestant forces gathering in northern Europe. But the marriage produced no children. Mary died in 1558 after only 4 years on the throne, and the crown passed to her Protestant half-sister, Elizabeth, who was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and who had spent her youth negotiating the dangers of Tudor court politics with the wariness that came from watching her mother executed. Philip had briefly, and probably not seriously, proposed marriage to Elizabeth in 1559. Elizabeth had declined, and the two monarchs had spent the next 3 decades in a relationship of increasing hostility that fell just short of open war for most of that period. Elizabeth's government provided support to the Dutch rebels against Spanish rule. English privateers, most famously Francis Drake, raided Spanish-American shipping and treasure fleets with tacit royal support and occasionally with explicit royal financing. Elizabeth executed Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587, removing the Catholic claimant to the English throne, whom Philip had been supporting as an alternative to Elizabeth. And Philip, who had endured all of this with the deliberate patience that characterized his rule, eventually concluded that the only solution was to end the Elizabethan regime through direct military action. The armada that sailed from Lisbon in May of 1588 was the largest fleet that Spain had ever assembled, consisting of roughly 130 ships carrying approximately 18,000 soldiers and 8,000 sailors. The plan was to sail up the English Channel, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army in the Spanish Netherlands, and transport that army across the Channel to invade England and depose Elizabeth. The plan was, in principle, executable, and Spanish military planners had spent considerable time working out its details. The problem was that in practice, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The Armada was harried by English ships throughout its passage up the Channel. It failed to establish reliable communication with Parma's army in the Netherlands. It was scattered by fireships during its anchorage off Calais. And when it attempted to escape by sailing north around the British Isles and returning to Spain via the Atlantic, it was caught by autumn storms that sank or wrecked over half the fleet on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Roughly two-thirds of the ships that had sailed from Lisbon never returned to Spain. The military disaster was compounded by the fiscal disaster of having spent 5 years' revenue on a fleet that had accomplished nothing. Philip's response to the Armada disaster was characteristic of the man. He accepted the outcome with the fatalism of his intense Catholic piety, declaring that he had sent his ships against men, not against wind and waves, and that God's will had been done. He immediately began preparing a second armada, though the resources for a second attempt were never really assembled at the scale of the first, and Spanish naval power never fully recovered from the losses of 1588. The Armada is often described as marking the beginning of English maritime ascendancy and the decline of Spanish naval power. And while this description is somewhat exaggerated, it captures a real shift in the balance of power at sea that would become progressively more pronounced over the following century. Philip lived another decade after the Armada, dying in September of 1598, and his final years were marked by increasing physical suffering from the gout that afflicted the entire Habsburg family, and from a wasting disease that his physicians could not diagnose. He died at the Escorial, in a small bedroom adjoining the chapel where he could hear the Mass being said even in his final illness, and he was buried in the crypt beneath the chapel that he had built specifically for the tombs of the Spanish Habsburgs. His last recorded conversations were about matters of state, about the disposition of paperwork on his desk, and about the readiness of his son to assume the responsibilities that were about to fall upon him. He worked, in essence, until he was physically incapable of continuing to work, and this too became part of the Spanish Habsburg identity, the model of the working monarch who considered rulership to be a religious vocation rather than a personal privilege. The son who inherited his throne was Philip III, and here we begin to encounter the specific problem that would eventually destroy the Spanish Habsburg branch. Philip III was not a bad man. He was pious, courteous, and personally amiable, but he had none of his father's methodical energy or his grandfather's tireless mobility. He was, by every account, an essentially passive ruler who preferred hunting and religious devotions to the exhausting labor of managing a global empire. His reign, from 1598 to 1621, saw the beginning of what Spanish historians call the decadencia, the decline, as the fiscal crisis that had been building throughout the 16th century accelerated. The American silver flows began to decline, and the various fronts of the Spanish imperial commitment became progressively less manageable with the resources available. Philip III's most significant decision was to delegate the actual business of governance to a favorite, a Valedor Generalia Valido, and this deserves a moment of attention because the emergence of the Valido as an institutional feature of Spanish government under the later Habsburgs is one of the specific patterns that distinguishes the Spanish branch from its Austrian cousin. The Valido was a chief minister who effectively conducted the government on the king's behalf, receiving delegated authority that was almost sovereign in its scope. Under Philip III, the Valido was the Duke of Lerma, a Valencian nobleman who accumulated enormous personal wealth during his tenure and whose primary concerns were the maintenance of his own position at court and the enrichment of his family and clients. Under Philip IV, who succeeded his father in 1621, the Valido was the Count Duke of Olivares, a considerably more capable and reform-minded figure who genuinely attempted to address the structural problems of the Spanish monarchy, but who was ultimately defeated by the accumulated weight of those problems and by his own political enemies at court. The Spanish Habsburgs, from the reign of Philip III onward, were also increasingly affected by the biological consequences of their family's marriage practices. And this brings us to a topic that requires careful treatment because it has entered popular history in forms that are sometimes exaggerated and sometimes not exaggerated enough. The Habsburg method, as we have discussed, was to acquire crowns through the strategic joining of bloodlines, and this had produced spectacular success in the 15th and 16th centuries as inheritances converged upon Charles V and his descendants. But the method also produced a problem. To keep the accumulated inheritances within the family, later Habsburgs increasingly married their own close relatives. First cousins married first cousins. Uncles married nieces. The pattern intensified from generation to generation, and the biological consequences accumulated in a manner that geneticists studying the family's records in the 21st century have documented with striking precision. The physical manifestation that popular history most commonly associates with the Habsburg family is the so-called Habsburg jaw, that prognathic malformation of the lower mandible that appears in family portraits from the 15th century onward, and that becomes progressively more pronounced in the Spanish branch across the 17th century. But the jaw was only the most visible symptom of a broader pattern of inbreeding depression that affected the family's fertility, immune systems, and general health. Charles V had it. Philip II had it, though less severely. Philip III had it. Philip IV had it. And Charles II, who was born in 1661 as the last Spanish Habsburg, had it in the most extreme form that the family had ever produced, along with a range of other physical and cognitive disabilities that made his reign one of the more tragic personal stories in European monarchical history. Before we come to Charles II, however, we need to address what happened during the reigns of Philip III and Philip IV, because the 17th century was the era in which the Spanish Habsburg position in Europe was progressively dismantled through a combination of external military defeats and internal structural problems. The most consequential of the external conflicts was the 30 Years' War, which began in 1618 in Bohemia and gradually expanded to involve most of the major powers of Europe by the time it ended with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Spanish forces fought throughout this war on behalf of their Austrian cousins, whose territory in Central Europe was directly threatened by the Protestant powers of the empire and by the entry of first Denmark, then Sweden, and eventually France into the anti-Habsburg coalition. Spanish infantry, which had been the finest fighting force in Europe for over a century, suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Rocroi in May of 1643, when a French army under the young Duke of Enghien broke the famous Spanish tercios in a manner that contemporaries recognized as the end of an era. The tercios had been invincible since the beginning of the 16th century. Rocroi demonstrated that they were no longer invincible, and Spanish military prestige never fully recovered from that battle. At home, the reign of Philip IV was marked by the Great Revolts of 1640. Catalonia rose against Castilian rule in an uprising that lasted 12 years and required a substantial military effort to suppress. Portugal declared its independence in December of 1640, ending the 60-year union of the Iberian crowns that Philip II had established in 1580, and re-established the Braganza dynasty that would rule Portugal until the 20th century. Andalusia produced a serious conspiracy for secession that was suppressed, but that revealed the depth of the fiscal grievances that Castilian rule was generating in the peripheral territories. Sicily and Naples produced urban revolts that were suppressed with considerable violence. The composite monarchy that Charles V had assembled and Philip II had consolidated was, by the middle of the 17th century, visibly breaking apart under fiscal and administrative pressures that no single ruler could fully address. Philip IV died in September of 1665, exhausted and prematurely aged at 60, and he left behind a 4-year-old son who would carry the Spanish Habsburg name into its final and most poignant chapter. Charles II, called El Hechizado, the Bewitched in the Spanish tradition, is one of the figures in European monarchical history whose personal tragedy is genuinely difficult to describe without either sentimentality or clinical detachment. And I want to try to describe him with the balance that his situation deserves, because he was a human being caught in a biological and political trap that he had done nothing to create and could do nothing to escape. The genetic accounting of the Spanish Habsburg line by the time Charles II was born is worth setting out because it explains a great deal about what happened to him. His parents were Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. Mariana was Philip's niece, meaning that Philip's own sister had been Mariana's mother. This uncle-niece marriage was not the only close consanguineous union in Charles II's ancestry. His parents were also related through multiple other lines going back several generations, and modern geneticists studying the family's genealogy have calculated that Charles II's inbreeding coefficient was approximately 0.254, which is higher than would be produced by a parent-child union. In practical terms, he was more genetically inbred than the offspring of a brother and sister would normally be, because his ancestry contained so many overlapping consanguineous connections that the effective coefficient exceeded what a single close incestuous union would produce. The consequences were visible from his birth. Charles was physically weak, could not walk unassisted until he was 8, could not speak coherently until he was nearly the same age. His Habsburg jaw was so pronounced that he could not chew food properly and had to be fed liquefied preparations throughout his life. He had digestive problems, chronic diarrhea, epileptic seizures, and cognitive limitations that made the standard education of a Spanish prince essentially impossible to administer. He was pious in a rote sort of way that reflected the intense religious atmosphere of the Spanish court, but that never developed into the theological seriousness of his ancestors. He was affectionate toward those who treated him kindly, which was probably his most consistent personal characteristic across his 35 years of life. And he understood, at some level, that he was the last of his line, and that the failure to produce an heir would end the Spanish Habsburg branch and reshape the political geography of Europe. He was married twice. His first wife was Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess and niece of Louis XIV, arranged as part of a diplomatic settlement that never really produced the political benefits it was designed to achieve. Marie-Louise died in 1689 after 10 years of childless marriage, in circumstances that some historians have found suspicious, with rumors of poisoning that were probably unfounded, but that reflected the political tensions of the Madrid court. His second wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a family known for its fertility, and the reasoning behind the match was almost embarrassingly direct. The Spanish court needed her to produce an heir. She did not produce one. Whether the infertility of both marriages was primarily due to Charles or to some combination of factors is a question that historians cannot definitively answer. But the surviving medical accounts of Charles's physical condition suggest that the primary cause was his own biological limitations. Charles's reign, from 1665 to 1700, was administered on his behalf by a series of regents, ministers, and factions who understood that they were managing an inheritance that was going to have to be transferred to some other family upon the king's death. The great question of the last decade of the 17th century, the question that consumed diplomatic energy across Europe from the courts of Vienna, Paris, London, and The Hague, was who would inherit the Spanish monarchy when Charles II finally died. The candidates were essentially three. The French Bourbon claim, through Louis XIV's marriage to Maria Theresa of Spain, could be pressed on behalf of Louis's grandson Philip of Anjou. The Austrian Habsburg claim, through the Austrian branch's kinship with the Spanish branch, could be pressed on behalf of the Emperor Leopold I or one of his sons. And a compromise candidate, the young Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, whose grandmother had been a Spanish infanta, was proposed by those who wanted to prevent either the French or the Austrian succession from producing an overwhelming shift in the European balance of power. Charles II himself, in his final months, wrestled with the succession question with an intensity that his physical condition made agonizing. He knew that whatever he decided would produce a European war. He knew that the future of the empire his ancestors had built depended on his choice. And he knew that his personal preferences had to be subordinated to the political calculations of what would give the Spanish inheritance the best chance of remaining intact under a single ruler rather than being partitioned among competing claimants. He was persuaded, in the end, that only a French Bourbon succession could provide the military resources to keep the empire together against the partition plans that other European powers were already drafting. He signed a will in October of 1700, leaving his entire inheritance to Philip of Anjou. He died on the 1st of November of that year at the age of 38, and the 2 centuries of Spanish Habsburg rule ended with him. The War of the Spanish Succession that followed his death consumed the first decade and a half of the 18th century, involved every major European power, and reshaped the political geography of the continent in ways that would persist until the French Revolution. Philip of Anjou, taking the throne as Philip V of Spain, held onto the Spanish crown and the American territories, but had to accept the loss of the European possessions outside Spain itself. The Spanish Netherlands passed to the Austrian Habsburgs, becoming the Austrian Netherlands. The Italian possessions, Naples, Sicily, Milan, and Sardinia, were distributed among the Austrian Habsburgs and other claimants at the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 and subsequent settlements. Britain acquired Gibraltar and Minorca, establishing a Mediterranean naval presence that would shape European affairs for the next 3 centuries. And the composite monarchy that Charles V had built and that Philip II had consolidated ceased to exist as a single political unit. Now, having brought the Spanish Habsburg branch to its extinction in 1700, we need to return to the Austrian branch and trace what had been happening there during the same century and a half. 2 branches, as we noted earlier, had diverged after 1556 and had followed different trajectories, and the Austrian branch was in some ways more resilient than its Spanish cousin because it faced different pressures and adapted to them differently. Ferdinand I, who had inherited the Austrian lands and the imperial title in 1556, ruled until 1564 and was succeeded by his son Maximilian II, who ruled until 1576. Maximilian II is an interesting figure who has often been overlooked because his reign fell between more dramatic periods, but he was a monarch with genuine tolerance for religious diversity that his family generally did not share, and he attempted to keep the religious peace within his territories through a combination of practical accommodation and personal restraint. He was suspected by his more zealous Catholic contemporaries of Protestant sympathies, and it is not clear whether these suspicions were justified. His son Rudolf II, who succeeded him in 1576 and ruled until 1612, is one of the more genuinely eccentric characters in the family's history, and deserves a moment of attention because he embodies a specific side of the Habsburg character that appears repeatedly across the centuries. Rudolf II moved the imperial court from Vienna to Prague, which had the practical advantage of being closer to the geographic center of his territories and the psychological advantage of removing him from the more demanding social expectations of the Austrian nobility. In Prague, he assembled one of the most extraordinary courts of the late Renaissance, patronizing artists, alchemists, astronomers, and occultists in roughly equal measure. He was the patron of Johannes Kepler, who did his most important astronomical work at Prague under Rudolf's protection, and of Tycho Brahe, whose observational data Kepler used to derive his laws of planetary motion. He commissioned art from Giuseppe Arcimboldo, whose famous composite portraits, including one that depicts Rudolf as the god Vertumnus made from vegetables and fruits, hangs today in the Skokloster Castle in Sweden. He amassed a collection of curiosities called the Kunstkammer that included natural specimens, mechanical devices, gemstones, and objects associated with legendary or magical properties. He was also, and this is the part that his contemporaries found increasingly problematic, essentially incapable of the practical business of governance. He avoided meetings. He delayed decisions for months or years. He conducted diplomacy through letters that he sometimes never sent, and that were often written in his own hand in a script that his correspondents found difficult to decipher. He was interested in the philosopher's stone and the transmutation of metals in a manner that suggested he took these projects seriously as scientific research, rather than as recreational curiosities. And by the last decade of his reign, his brother Matthias was effectively conducting most of the government of the Habsburg territories on his behalf. having secured formal control of most of the family's lands through a series of arrangements that Rudolf accepted with the resignation of a man who understood that his own limitations had made intervention necessary. The tensions within the family and within the empire that Rudolf's disengagement produced set the stage for the great crisis that would erupt in 1618. The immediate trigger was in Bohemia, where the Catholic Habsburg policy of restricting Protestant religious practices had produced accumulating grievances among the Bohemian Protestant nobility. On the 23rd of May in 1618, a group of Bohemian Protestant nobles entered the Prague castle, seized 3 Catholic officials representing the imperial government, and threw them out of a window into the courtyard below. The 3 officials survived their fall, landing in a dung heap, or in the case of the more pious accounts, being caught by angels sent by the Virgin Mary. But the defenestration became the symbolic beginning of a political and military rupture that spread rapidly across the empire and eventually across Europe. The 30 Years' War that followed the defenestration of Prague deserves a treatment more extensive than we can give it here, but its essential character for our purposes can be described briefly. What began as a Bohemian revolt against Habsburg policy expanded to involve the Palatinate, then Denmark, then Sweden, and eventually France as external powers intervened for their own strategic reasons. The imperial armies of Ferdinand II, who had succeeded Matthias in 1619, were often successful in the field, and there were moments, particularly in the late 1620s, when it seemed possible that the Habsburgs might use the war to consolidate imperial authority across Germany in ways that would have transformed the empire into something more like the centralized monarchies emerging in France and Spain. The Edict of Restitution in 1629, which attempted to reverse the alienation of Catholic Church property that had occurred since the Peace of Augsburg, was the high water mark of this effort. But the intervention of Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden in 1630, and eventually of Cardinal Richelieu's France in 1635, reversed the trajectory, and the war ground on for another 18 years with escalating destruction and diminishing returns for all parties. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War, is one of those settlements that historians describe as marking the beginning of the modern European state system. And while such descriptions are always oversimplifications, there is something genuinely modern about what Westphalia established. The peace acknowledged that the Holy Roman Emperor could not enforce religious uniformity across the empire, that the German princes had achieved a level of practical sovereignty that made the empire more a confederation than a unified state, and that international disputes were going to be settled by negotiations among sovereign powers rather than by appeal to universal spiritual or imperial authority. For the Austrian Habsburgs, Westphalia meant accepting that their imperial title, while still enormously prestigious, was no longer an instrument through which they could actually govern most of Germany. Their real power base was going to be their hereditary lands, meaning Austria, Bohemia, and the portion of Hungary they controlled, and they would have to build their future strategy around consolidating those territories rather than around dominating the empire as such. This shift produced, over the second half of the 17th century and the first half of the 18th, what historians call the Austrian monarchy, meaning the composite state built around the Habsburg hereditary territories that gradually developed its own institutional identity separate from its imperial functions. Ferdinand III, who succeeded his father Ferdinand II in 1637 and negotiated the Peace of Westphalia, began this consolidation with a pragmatism that his more zealous father had lacked. His son Leopold I, who ruled from 1658 to 1705, continued the process across nearly half a century, and Leopold's reign coincided with 2 developments that would prove decisive for the Austrian branch's future. The first was the reconquest of Hungary from the Ottoman Empire. The second was the acquisition of the Spanish inheritance in the War of the Spanish Succession, which we have already touched on. The Ottoman question, which had been a defining feature of Habsburg foreign policy since Suleiman's siege of Vienna in 1529, came to a climax in the summer of 1683, when the Ottoman Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha led an army of roughly 150,000 men against Vienna itself, initiating the Second Great Ottoman Siege of the Habsburg capital. Leopold I had fled the city before the siege began, and the defense was conducted by Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg with a garrison of approximately 15,000 men, supplemented by the citizens of Vienna who had organized themselves into militia companies for the defense of the walls. The siege lasted from mid-July until early September, and the Ottoman engineers came very close to breaching the fortifications through mining operations that would have opened the city to a general assault. What saved Vienna was one of the more remarkable feats of military coordination of the 17th century. Pope Innocent XI had been organizing a Christian coalition to defend the city, and the coalition army that assembled north of Vienna in early September combined imperial troops with a substantial Polish contingent led by King Jan Sobieski of Poland. On the 12th of September in 1683, this coalition army descended from the Kahlenberg Heights north of the city and struck the Ottoman camp in a battle that lasted most of the day and that concluded with the complete destruction of the Ottoman force. Sobieski's Polish cavalry, including the famous winged hussars, played a decisive role in the final charges, and the battle became one of the great symbolic moments of European military history, celebrated repeatedly across the following centuries as the salvation of Christian Europe from Ottoman conquest. Kara Mustafa Pasha, having lost his army, retreated to Belgrade, where he was executed on the Sultan's orders for the failure of the campaign. The victory at Vienna in 1683 was not merely defensive. It initiated a sustained Habsburg offensive against the Ottoman position in Central Europe that continued for the next 16 years and that transformed the geographic situation of the Austrian monarchy. Under the military leadership of Charles of Lorraine, and subsequently under the even more effective leadership of Prince Eugene of Savoy, imperial armies pressed south and east into the Hungarian territories that had been under Ottoman occupation since Mohacs. Buda fell to the imperial forces in 1686 after 145 years of Ottoman rule. Belgrade was captured in 1688 and lost again in 1690 in the complicated back and forth of the frontier warfare of the period. And the great victory of Eugene of Savoy at Zenta in September 1697 broke Ottoman military capacity in the region so thoroughly that the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 transferred nearly all of Hungary, along with Transylvania and portions of Croatia and Slavonia, to Habsburg rule. The acquisition of Hungary is one of the transformative events in the Austrian branch's history because it approximately doubled the size and population of the Habsburg territories in Central Europe and gave the monarchy a genuine geopolitical weight that it had never previously possessed. But it also created new problems. Hungarian nobility was proud, autonomous-minded, and skeptical of Habsburg centralization. Hungarian Protestants had grievances against Catholic policies. The territories acquired from the Ottomans included substantial populations of Serbs, Romanians, Slovaks, and other groups whose religious and political affiliations did not align neatly with the Habsburg framework. The Hungarian revolt of Ferenc Rákóczi from 1703 to 1711 demonstrated that the incorporation of Hungary into the Austrian monarchy would be a project of decades rather than a single military conquest. And yet, when the incorporation was eventually completed, it gave the Austrian Habsburgs a territorial base that would sustain them through the 18th and 19th centuries as a European great power. Leopold, I lived long enough to see the beginning of the War of the Spanish Succession, which, as we have discussed, erupted after Charles II's death in 1700 and consumed European diplomatic and military energy through the first 15 years of the 18th century. Leopold pressed the Austrian claim to the Spanish inheritance on behalf of his younger son Charles, later Charles VI, and the resulting settlement at Utrecht and Rastatt in 1713 and 1714 transferred the Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Naples, Sardinia, and other Italian possessions to the Austrian branch. The Austrian Habsburgs did not get the Spanish throne itself, which went to Philip of Anjou, but they got most of the European portions of the old Habsburg Empire, and this substantially enlarged the territorial base of the Austrian monarchy at exactly the moment when Hungary was being fully incorporated into it. Leopold I died in May of 1705 and was succeeded briefly by his elder son Joseph I, who ruled for only 6 years before dying of smallpox in 1711. Joseph's death without male heirs brought his younger brother Charles VI to the throne. Charles VI is a figure whose reign of nearly 3 decades, from 1711 to 1740, was consumed almost entirely by a single obsession. And that obsession was the question of what would happen to the Habsburg inheritance when he himself died without a male heir. Because Charles VI had a peculiar problem. He had daughters but no sons who survived to adulthood, and the traditional inheritance rules of the various Habsburg territories excluded female succession in ways that were not uniform across the different lands. Bohemia had one rule, Hungary had another, Austria had another, the Netherlands had another, and the imperial dignity itself had a specific set of restrictions that had never been designed to accommodate a female successor. Charles VI's solution to this problem was a document called the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, which established a uniform succession law across all the Habsburg territories, permitted female succession in the absence of male heirs, and specified that the Habsburg inheritance would remain undivided rather than being partitioned among multiple heirs, as had happened in earlier generations. The Pragmatic Sanction was a legal instrument of considerable ingenuity, but its effectiveness depended on being recognized by the other European powers as valid international law, and Charles VI spent the last 20 years of his reign in a nearly continuous diplomatic campaign to secure such recognition. He signed treaty after treaty with individual powers, made concessions to secure their assent, and by the late 1730s had accumulated recognition from most of the significant European states. His eldest daughter, Maria Theresa, was thus, in his understanding, secured in her inheritance by the accumulated weight of international recognition. The problem, as the events of 1740 would demonstrate, was that international treaties are worth exactly as much as the power available to enforce them, and Charles VI had spent so much of his reign negotiating diplomatic recognition of the Pragmatic Sanction that he had substantially neglected the military and fiscal foundations that would be needed to defend it. When he died in October of 1740, at the age of 55, his 23-year-old daughter Maria Theresa inherited a monarchy whose finances were in disarray, whose army was underfunded, and whose neighbors immediately concluded that a young, inexperienced queen would be unable to defend her inheritance against determined attack. Frederick II of Prussia, who had come to the throne only a few months before Charles VI died, seized the moment. Prussia invaded the wealthy Habsburg province of Silesia in December of 1740 with almost no diplomatic preparation and no serious pretext, simply calculating that Silesia was too valuable and Prussia's opportunity too rare to pass up. France, seeing Prussia's success, joined the war against Maria Theresa in 1741, along with Bavaria, Saxony, and Spain, each with its own reasons for wanting to dismember the Habsburg inheritance. Charles Albert of Bavaria was even elected Holy Roman Emperor as Charles VII, interrupting the Habsburg hold on the imperial title for the only time between 1438 and 1806. The situation looked genuinely desperate. What saved Maria Theresa was the combination of her own personal qualities and the unexpected loyalty of her Hungarian subjects. In September of 1741, she traveled to the Hungarian Diet at Pozsony, appeared before the assembled Hungarian nobility carrying her infant son Joseph in her arms, and addressed them in Latin, appealing to their sense of chivalric obligation to defend a young queen in her hour of need. The Hungarian nobility responded with an outpouring of support that provided the Habsburg monarchy with the military resources it needed to continue the war. Vitam et sanguinem pro rege nostro Maria Theresia, they reportedly cried, our life and blood for our King Maria Theresa. The Hungarian formulation is worth pausing over because it captures the constitutional peculiarity of her position. She was legally the King of Hungary rather than the Queen, since the Hungarian coronation ceremony was specifically for a monarch called the King regardless of the actual sex of the person crowned, and the Hungarian nobility was pledging its blood to the male grammatical form of her office, even as they acknowledged the female person occupying it. The War of the Austrian Succession, as the conflict came to be called, dragged on for 8 years and ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. Maria Theresa lost Silesia to Prussia, which was a substantial territorial and economic blow that she never fully accepted, and that she would attempt to recover in the 7 Years' War 15 years later without success. But the essential fact of the settlement was that Maria Theresa retained the rest of the Habsburg inheritance intact, and her husband Francis Stephen of Lorraine was elected Holy Roman Emperor as Francis I, restoring the imperial title to the family after the brief Bavarian interruption. Maria Theresa was not herself the Holy Roman Emperor, since the imperial dignity remained restricted to men, but she was the effective ruler of the Habsburg lands and the political partner in whose name Francis exercised his imperial functions. The specific arrangement gave rise to the terminology that historians use for the dynasty from this point forward, the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, since all subsequent Habsburg rulers descended from the marriage of Maria Theresa and Francis Stephen, and thus carried the Lorraine name in their male line while continuing to be understood as Habsburgs in their political identity. Maria Theresa is one of the great monarchs of the 18th century, and she deserves careful treatment because her reign of 40 years shaped the character of the Austrian monarchy in ways that persisted until 1918. She was practical, personally devout, politically shrewd, and possessed of a genuine understanding of the fiscal and administrative reforms that her territories needed. She reorganized the tax system, professionalized the civil service, standardized weights and measures across the various Habsburg territories, reformed the army along Prussian lines while resisting the Prussian model in matters of political culture, and expanded state authority into areas that had previously been the preserve of the church and the nobility. She reduced the labor obligations that peasants owed to their landlords, established public education systems, and pursued a program of religious policy that was Catholic in orientation but pragmatic in application, tolerating Protestants in her territories more thoroughly than her father had done while maintaining the Catholic character of the state. She was also, and this is one of the personal features of her reign that particularly impressed her contemporaries, a mother on a genuinely prodigious scale. She had 16 children with Francis Stephen, of whom 10 reached adulthood, and she involved herself in their upbringing with an intensity that was unusual for royal women of her era. She wrote them detailed instructional letters throughout their lives. She arranged their marriages with the calculation of a family strategist working within a tradition that stretched back to Maximilian I. Her daughter Maria Carolina was married to Ferdinand IV of Naples. Her daughter Maria Amelia was married to Ferdinand of Parma. Her daughter Marie Antoinette was married to the future Louis XVI of France, an arrangement that connected the Habsburg dynasty to the Bourbon dynasty, and that would end 30 years later in the tragedy of the French Revolution. And her sons, most consequentially Joseph and Leopold, would eventually succeed her and continue the family's business. Joseph II, who ruled first as co-regent with his mother from 1765, and then as sole ruler after her death in 1780 until his own death in 1790, is one of the more fascinating and controversial figures in the family's later history. He was the great Habsburg embodiment of what historians call enlightened absolutism, meaning the attempt to apply Enlightenment ideas about rational government, religious tolerance, administrative efficiency, and social reform through the mechanism of absolute monarchical authority. He issued thousands of decrees in his brief personal reign, reorganized virtually every aspect of the monarchy's administration, abolished serfdom in the Habsburg territories, extended religious toleration to Protestants and Jews on terms that were unusually generous by the standards of 18th century Europe, subordinated the Catholic Church to state supervision in matters that had traditionally been the preserve of Rome, dissolved contemplative monasteries whose social utility he considered inadequate, and attempted to impose German as the administrative language across territories where it had never been the common tongue. The problem with Joseph's approach, and it was a problem that his mother had understood better than he did, was that his reforms tended to alienate almost every social group in the monarchy simultaneously. The nobility resented the erosion of its traditional privileges. The Catholic Church resented the state interference in ecclesiastical affairs. The non-German nationalities resented the imposition of German as an administrative language. The peasants who benefited from the abolition of serfdom nonetheless found themselves caught up in changes whose ultimate direction they did not understand. And by the end of his reign, Joseph had produced revolts in Hungary, in the Netherlands, and in the Italian territories that forced him to reverse most of his reforms before his death in February of 1790. His famous self-composed epitaph, according to the tradition, described him as a monarch whose intentions were always good but whose enterprises had all failed. This is probably too harsh a self-assessment. Some of his reforms persisted and shaped the subsequent development of the monarchy, but the pattern of ambitious reform running into the resistance of established interests would define much of the Habsburg experience across the 19th century. Joseph was succeeded by his younger brother Leopold II, whose reign lasted only 2 years, but who managed in that brief time to pacify most of the revolts that Joseph had provoked. Leopold died in 1792 and was succeeded by his son Francis II, whose reign of 43 years from 1792 to 1835 would encompass the greatest external challenge that the Habsburg dynasty had faced since the Ottoman sieges. That challenge was, of course, the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. The revolution that erupted in France in July of 1789 was, for the Habsburg court, personally distressing because Marie Antoinette was Francis II's aunt, and her progressive imprisonment, humiliation, and eventual execution in October of 1793 was experienced within the family as a personal tragedy as well as a political catastrophe. The French revolutionary government's execution of Louis XVI in January of 1793 and of Marie Antoinette 9 months later effectively guaranteed that the Habsburg monarchy would be permanently opposed to the revolutionary regime and its successors. Austria fought France repeatedly across the 23 years of warfare that stretched from 1792 to 1815, losing more often than winning, ceding territories at the peace treaties that followed the various campaigns, and watching the political geography of Central Europe be reshaped by Napoleon Bonaparte in ways that undid much of what previous generations of Habsburgs had built. The most consequential loss during this period was not territorial but symbolic. In August of 1806, faced with Napoleon's reorganization of the German states into the Confederation of the Rhine under French patronage, Francis II formally dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, the imperial title that the Habsburgs had held almost continuously since 1438, that they had inherited in various ways from Charlemagne, and that connected them to a tradition stretching back to the Roman imperial idea itself, was simply abolished by the last man to hold it. Francis had, 2 years earlier in 1804, established a new imperial title for himself as Emperor of Austria, using a title that specifically applied to the family's hereditary territories rather than to any broader Christian imperium. From 1804 forward, the Habsburgs would be emperors of Austria rather than Holy Roman emperors, and the specific title that the family had built its identity around for over 3 centuries ceased to exist. The Napoleonic Wars ended, as everyone knows, with Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in June of 1815 and the settlement of the Congress of Vienna that followed. And the Congress of Vienna is one of those historical events where the Habsburgs, and specifically Francis II's foreign minister Clemens von Metternich, played a role that far exceeded what the actual military contribution of Austria would have suggested. Metternich understood that the great question of the post-Napoleonic settlement was how to organize a European system that would prevent the recurrence of revolutionary upheaval, and he designed a diplomatic architecture based on the coordination of the great powers that would come to be called the Concert of Europe. The Congress of Vienna restored the Habsburgs to most of their pre-Napoleonic possessions, added new territories in northern Italy, including Lombardy and Venetia, and established Austria as the dominant power in the newly created German Confederation. For the next 33 years, until the revolutions of 1848, Metternich's system would provide relative stability across Europe, and Austria would function as one of the essential coordinating powers of that system. But the underlying trend of the 19th century was against the multinational dynastic empire that the Habsburg monarchy represented. Nationalism, meaning the political idea that the state should be organized around a single ethnic and linguistic community, was the great revolutionary force of the century, and the Habsburg monarchy was structurally incapable of accommodating it. The monarchy included Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Italians, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and various smaller groups, and no reorganization of the state along national lines could satisfy all of these groups simultaneously. Every concession to one nationality inevitably alienated others. The best that Habsburg statesmen could manage was to hold the monarchy together through a combination of dynastic loyalty, careful balancing of nationalities against each other, and the gradual extension of participation in political life, without allowing any single group to dominate the others. The revolutions of 1848 tested this arrangement to its limits. Vienna itself experienced revolutionary upheaval that forced Metternich into exile, and that led to the abdication of the Emperor Ferdinand I, who had succeeded his father Francis in 1835, and who was, in personal terms, incapable of managing the crisis. Ferdinand suffered from severe epilepsy and cognitive limitations that had been visible from his birth, and that made him unable to conduct the business of governance. He was, in some ways, the last severely afflicted Habsburg, another manifestation of the accumulated consequences of dynastic intermarriage, though less extreme than the Spanish branch's final case. The imperial family, led by the Archduchess Sophie, arranged his abdication in December of 1848 in favor of his 18-year-old nephew Franz Joseph, whose reign would extend across the next 68 years, and who would become one of the defining figures of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Franz Joseph came to the throne in the middle of a crisis, with Hungarian nationalists demanding independence, Italian nationalists demanding independence, the various Slavic nationalities demanding recognition, and the monarchy's armies engaged on multiple fronts. He was disciplined, personally austere, and possessed of an almost superhuman capacity for the sustained routine of monarchical labor. He rose at 4 in the morning, worked through paperwork for hours, attended meetings and audiences throughout the day, and maintained this schedule with only minor variations across nearly 7 decades. He conceived of himself as the servant of his office and of the monarchy, and this conception was not a public performance, but a genuine internal orientation that shaped every aspect of his behavior. The Hungarian Revolt of 1848 to 1849 was suppressed with Russian military assistance, and the settlement that followed attempted to reorganize the monarchy along more centralized lines. This attempt failed. Hungarian resistance to Austrian centralization continued through the 1850s in less spectacular forms, and after Austria's defeat by Prussia in the 7 Weeks' War of 1866, which we will return to in a moment, Franz Joseph accepted that the Hungarian problem could only be solved through a fundamental restructuring of the monarchy. The Compromise of 1867, negotiated primarily by the Hungarian statesman Ferenc Deák and the Austrian minister Friedrich Ferdinand von Beust, created the dual monarchy, meaning the transformation of the Habsburg state into 2 constitutionally distinct entities, the Austrian Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary, united in the person of the monarch and in the coordination of foreign policy, defense, and the finances that supported those functions, but otherwise administered separately. The Compromise of 1867 is one of the more ingenious constitutional arrangements of the 19th century, and it purchased another 50 years of Habsburg survival at the cost of institutionalizing a division within the monarchy that would prove impossible to bridge. Franz Joseph would henceforth be Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, would be crowned separately with the crown of St. Stephen in Budapest, would have to maintain two separate parliaments, two separate governments, two separate systems of civil administration, and would have to coordinate their common affairs through joint ministries whose authority was carefully limited. The Hungarian half of the monarchy pursued policies of aggressive majorization toward its non-Hungarian populations, particularly the Romanians, Slovaks, and Croats, which produced the accumulated resentment that would prove disastrous when the monarchy collapsed in 1918. The Austrian half of the monarchy struggled with the same nationality problems in different forms, particularly the Czech question in Bohemia and the Polish question in Galicia and the German nationalist agitation across the empire. Meanwhile, the international position of Austria had been reshaped by the wars of Italian and German unification. In 1859, Austria fought France and Piedmont Sardinia in a war that lost the province of Lombardy, transferring it to what would become the Kingdom of Italy. In 1866, Austria fought Prussia in what contemporaries called the 7 Weeks' War, and the decisive Prussian victory at Königgrätz on the 3rd of July in that year effectively excluded Austria from German affairs. Bismarck's Prussia proceeded to organize the North German Confederation and eventually the German Empire without Austrian participation, ending the Habsburg role in Germany that had persisted for over 4 centuries. The monarchy pivoted eastward and southward after 1866, focusing its remaining energies on maintaining its position in Central Europe and on managing the accumulating crises in the Balkans, where Ottoman decline was creating opportunities and dangers in roughly equal measure. The personal life of Franz Joseph during these decades was marked by tragedies whose accumulation seems, in retrospect, almost impossible for a single individual to have endured. His younger brother Maximilian accepted the throne of Mexico in 1864 in an ill-considered scheme sponsored by Napoleon III of France, and was executed by a Mexican firing squad in 1867 when the French withdrew their military support and the Republican forces of Benito Juárez captured him. His only son, Rudolph, the Crown Prince, killed himself along with his young mistress Mary Wetzera at the hunting lodge of Mayerling in January of 1889, in circumstances that remained mysterious for decades and that are still incompletely understood. His wife Elizabeth, known as Sissy in the popular tradition, who had spent most of her marriage traveling across Europe to escape the formal atmosphere of the Viennese court, was assassinated by an Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini at Geneva in September of 1898, stabbed with a sharpened file that punctured her heart. And in June of 1914, his nephew Franz Ferdinand, who had become heir to the throne after Rudolph's suicide, was assassinated with his wife Sophie in Sarajevo by a young Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. The Sarajevo assassination on the 28th of June in 1914 is one of the most consequential single events in modern history, because the crisis it produced escalated through the alliance systems of the European great powers into the First World War. Franz Joseph, now 83 years old and having spent 66 years on the throne, presided over the decision to issue the ultimatum to Serbia, whose rejection would provide the pretext for war. The specific character of the decision-making in Vienna in July of 1914 has been debated by historians for over a century, and it is not clear how much personal responsibility Franz Joseph should bear for the outcome, as opposed to his ministers and generals. What is clear is that he signed the mobilization orders, that he understood the risks of general European war, and that he believed the monarchy's survival required action against Serbia, even at the price of that risk. The First World War destroyed the Habsburg monarchy. Not immediately, and not through direct military defeat in the initial campaigns, but through the accumulated exhaustion of a multinational state whose various nationalities had never been fully committed to a single political project. The war lasted 4.5 years, killed millions of the monarchy's soldiers, exhausted its economic capacity, and progressively undermined the legitimacy of the imperial framework in the eyes of the various national groups. Franz Joseph did not live to see the end. He died in November of 1916 at the age of 86, having been emperor for so long that most of his subjects had never known any other monarch. His grandnephew Karl I succeeded him and attempted, across the remaining 2 years of the war, to negotiate a separate peace and to preserve some form of the monarchy through federalization along national lines. These attempts failed. By the autumn of 1918, the various nationalities were declaring their independence and forming successor states. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, an independent Hungary, and a rump Austrian republic emerged from the collapse. Karl I formally renounced participation in the affairs of state in November of 1918, went into exile in Switzerland, and made 2 failed attempts to reclaim the Hungarian throne in 1921 before being exiled to Madeira by the Allied powers. He died there of pneumonia in April of 1922 at the age of 34 and was buried in the Church of Our Lady of the Mount above Funchal. The Habsburg monarchy, which had begun with Rudolf's acquisition of Austria in 1278, ended with Karl's abdication in 1918. 640 years of continuous Habsburg rule over the Austrian territories, 330 years of Habsburg rule over Hungary and Bohemia, 480 years of nearly continuous Habsburg imperial rule in Central Europe, ended in the space of a few weeks in the autumn of 1918. The family did not disappear. Otto von Habsburg, Karl's eldest son, lived until 2011 and became a significant figure in the European integration movement of the late 20th century, serving in the European Parliament and advocating for the reunification of Central Europe that eventually followed the collapse of the Soviet system. The various Habsburg family members continued as private citizens across Europe and the Americas, adapting to the disappearance of the political framework that had defined their ancestors' existence for 6 centuries. What can we say about the 600 years of Habsburg history, having traced its arc from the modest castle in Switzerland to the palaces of Vienna, Madrid, Prague, and Brussels, from the small territorial base of 11th century Swabia to the composite monarchy that extended across 3 continents at its peak? The most important thing, I think, is that the Habsburg method worked for as long as it did, because it responded to the specific conditions of European political life between roughly 1400 and 1800. In an era where legitimacy depended on hereditary claims, where territories were acquired through inheritance and marriage as much as through conquest, and where the coordination of multiple crowns under a single dynasty was accepted as a legitimate form of political organization, the Habsburg strategy of patient marital accumulation produced results that no other family could match. Charles V's inheritance was not the product of any single generation's brilliance. It was the product of 5 generations of patient method, of the willingness to arrange marriages decades in advance, of the discipline to sustain family strategy across the changing personalities of individual monarchs. The method also had costs, and those costs became progressively more evident across the 17th and 18th centuries. The biological consequences of dynastic intermarriage produced the physical and cognitive limitations that afflicted the later Spanish Habsburgs and contributed to the branch's extinction in 1700. The political consequences of trying to hold together territories with different institutional traditions, different languages, and different religious profiles produced the accumulated fiscal and administrative crises that afflicted both branches throughout their later histories. The Habsburg monarchy at its greatest extent was, in some ways, ungovernable, and the recognition of this fact eventually forced Charles V to divide his inheritance and forced later generations to accept progressive contractions of their territorial ambitions. The monarchy's final century, from the Congress of Vienna to the First World War, was a struggle against a form of political organization, the nationalist nation-state, that was fundamentally incompatible with the multinational dynastic empire that the Habsburgs had built. The struggle was managed with considerable ingenuity, and the fact that the monarchy survived until 1918, despite the accumulated pressures of nationalism, defeat in war, and internal contradiction, is a testament to the institutional resources that centuries of Habsburg governance had built up. But the outcome was, in retrospect, probably inevitable. The world that the Habsburgs had been built to govern had ceased to exist, and no reorganization of the monarchy could have reconciled its structure to the political ideas of the modern era. There is a specific melancholy that hangs over the story of the last Habsburgs. Franz Joseph in his enormous desk at the Hofburg, working through paperwork at 4 in the morning, presiding over an institution whose collapse he could see approaching but could not prevent. Karl I on Madeira, dying at 34 of a disease that better circumstances might have permitted him to survive. Zita, Karl's widow, living until 1989 and returning briefly to Austria only near the end of her life, having outlived not only the monarchy but the 20th century that had destroyed it. The family that had produced Charles V and Philip II and Maria Theresa and Franz Joseph ended its political existence with an exiled young couple on a Portuguese island. And there is something in that ending that requires acknowledgement, even as we recognize that the political system they represented had no place in the world that came after them. And there you have it. 600 years of Habsburg history in about 3 hours. I mean, if you listen to the end of this, you really are quite special. So you should give yourself a pat on the back. I've enjoyed doing this one. I hope you enjoyed listening. And well, perhaps some more dynastic history coming up. The Evil Popes series and the Antipopes video seem to be quite popular, so perhaps we'll do a little more. Maybe we'll do the Romanovs, the Bourbons, the Ottomans, the Tudors. Who knows? Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you very much to those supporting the channel in terms of crowdfunding us, keeping us ad and sponsor free. Links are in the description and pinned comment. And thank you to everyone who liked, commented, subscribed, told their friends, all of that good stuff. I have been your host, and I wish you all the best out there. Good night and farewell.